So she works with undergrads on research and also postdocs, but doesn't actually have graduate students there to work with. I think their university is about the size of our undergrad majors, so they get a lot of personal attention there. She got her Ph.D. at University of Kentucky, so learned about basketball and used to root for like that. She's also done a number of interesting things. She's been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Amsterdam, and now is a director of the Summer Institute on Substance Abuse there. So today we're going to learn a little bit about her research. Welcome. Thank you very much. We're glad to have you here. Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Of course, now I probably broke it. All right, well, I will try to project, but if I get too soft, just let me know. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of my research work with you today. I know many people I've talked to in the department have done work on terms of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, areas of demography that have become of greater interest to us as I think our country is coming to grips with the fact that we are a diverse set of communities, and that as we diversify our science, our focus changes. And I really have a lot of gratitude to see the graduate students who I met today who are interested in this area, because we need more young scientists with a commitment to this type of work. So as I said, or as my introduction said, I'm at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. We're a very small school. We're 1,350 undergraduates, about 140 faculty, and 8 of us in the psychology department. So you might ask yourself, how did I end up working on this very large national multi-site field trial? Basically, I came to Reed from UC San Diego, and I was part of the departments of both psychology as well as psychiatry there. So some of the work I'm going to share with you today really comes from the work of Sandra Brown, who is a leader in adolescent substance use research, and I was incredibly lucky to have her be my postdoctoral mentor. And I stayed on in San Diego as a research scientist before I decided to move north. So a lot of the work that I'm going to share with you today really started in her work in the mid to late 1990s. I didn't become involved in this work until the early 2000s, so I'll kind of share with you that trajectory. And I have to say it's a little distressing when I realize how long that is at this point. So basically, I just some disclosures about my funding sources. So I'm sharing with you at that top line is funding for my lab, which is the Adolescent Health Research Program at Reed. I've been very fortunate to receive funding from NIH, both NIDA and NIAAA, as well as ABMRF. And then the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which funded a lot of my graduate and postdoctoral training, also has funded Project Options since the late 1990s. This work today is also supported by the Women's Health Initiative. If you're not familiar with this, this is an initiative at NIH to make sure that our science speaks to the needs of girls and women, and that we are also using even laboratory cell lines that represent women's contributions to society, I guess you could say it that way, or the species, I guess. And then also a diversity fellowship to my postdoc, Dr. Tracy Garcia, who's now at the University of Washington. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit generally about prevention, a little bit about alcohol and other drug use in youth, and then talk about the particular project intervention program that I'm going to share with you today. So what this schematic is, this comes from the Institute of Medicine report in 2008 that really took on this notion of how do we understand prevention in the modern era, right? For those of you who've done prevention work in the past, there was a change in terminology, but certainly a broadening of focus on how we understand prevention. So we really think about it not just in terms of preventing illness, but we also think about it starting at the level of health promotion. So how do we increase those protective factors that individuals hold? How do we enhance well-being and provide tools to avoid adverse consequences? The next step along that line and that continuum is really prevention, and that's a lot of my focus today. How do we work with individuals prior to the onset of a disorder to prevent or reduce risk? And very much we're familiar with the treatment side of this equation along the top, right? We target particular individuals who are currently suffering from a particular disorder, and we really work to cure or reduce symptoms. Okay? Now, we can think about these intervention strategies, as I said, along a continuum, targeting a number of different aspects that we see here, right? We can have youth who are embedded in various family contexts, communities, and cultures. And then we can also think of different settings in which intervention can happen, right? Often we focus on school-based prevention, okay? In my case, that's where the kids are, okay? We also find that school-based prevention can be particularly effective at accessing youth who may be unrepresented or have lower levels of access to care, who usually marginalized or underrepresented groups who just don't have access to other intervention services. So the school is a great way. Eric Wagner in Florida, one of my colleagues on this project at FIU, has done a lot of work about how do we access kids who are facing barriers to care. So that's why we focus on that particular group. For those of you who are not adolescent youth specialists, I want to talk a little bit about what we know from the epidemiological data. I'm going to be sharing data today from the Monitoring the Future study. This is the recent release on data from 2016. These assessments happen in schools in 8th, 10th, 12th grade, and in alternating time periods we do collegiate. They assess collegiate use patterns as well. So we can look across a various frame of development. There's about, in this particular sample, almost 46,000 students, so it's fairly representative across the United States. Now, what we see in general is alcohol use has been on the decline. Really, alcohol and other drug use peaked in the 1970s. It started to drop. We had another resurgence in the 90s into the early 2000s, and we've been dropping again. So the good news from a prevention side is that we see that drinking, especially binge drinking or hazardous drinking, is on the decline. We also have seen a precipitous decline in the use of tobacco and cigarettes. That's probably in one way, I would say, one of our success stories in prevention. And this comes through a constellation of different factors involving tobacco regulation and kind of macro level factors like increasing sin taxes, as well as direct prevention efforts. What we have seen, though, as we look at marijuana use, it's remaining fairly steady. We do see changes, however, with the advent of medical marijuana initiatives, and I live in a recreational legal state, where what we're seeing, though, is changes in cognition associated with use. While use patterns are staying fairly stagnant, we do see that the perceptions of harm are reducing. That's concerning to us from a prevention perspective, because there is a cyclical relationship between cognitions and concerns about harm and use patterns. I can't say it's a directional relationship, it's more cyclical. Another area of interest is what happens after youth leave high school. Now, a lot of my work, my focus in my work is the developmental psychopathology of addictive behaviors from 10 to 25. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I tend to take that perspective. So if we're showing improvement in this younger cohort of 14 to 18-year-olds, how are we doing in emerging adults, that period from 18 to 25? In terms of drinking, we still see differences among youth who attend college versus do not attend college in terms of alcohol consumption. Here the data is listed as past 2-week consumption and past month consumption. It's not atypical, and we've seen for many, many years, 20 years or so, if not longer, that college students actually consume more alcohol than their non-college attending peers, which is interesting because the pattern in high school is that non-college attending peers tend to have higher levels of alcohol and other drug consumption than their college attending peers before high school. Then contextual changes happen in the university context where we see greater alcohol consumption among undergraduates. An area of concern for me and in my work, where I tend to focus on alcohol and marijuana because they're the most commonly used substances, is marijuana use. We've now come back to the 1980s level of marijuana engagement in people in the 18 to 25-year-old cohort, right? We definitely see pattern differences as it relates to non-college and college-attending peers, but overall what we're seeing is higher rates of marijuana consumption than we've seen in the past. So while we may want to pat ourselves on the back as preventionists in terms of the changes we're seeing at the high school level, this is still concerning. The highest rate of engagement with alcohol and other drugs is the age 18 to 25, right? That's always been the peak area. But now what we're wondering is where's the message breaking down? And it's too early. People often ask me about recreational legal states because I live in one. It's too early for us to tell based on the data. Anecdotally, we know from research from Monitoring the Future, for the last 20 years, kids have told us it's a lot easier in high school. It's a lot easier to get marijuana than alcohol or tobacco, right? So access drives use for youth. So one question we have to ask ourselves is, if we're seeing these increased patterns and we now have recreational legal at 21, where is that relationship? Okay, and it's an open question, something that we need to, as a field, explore. So this is just an illustration here, right? This is not based on real data, but it's something for you to think about. So around the bottom here, this is 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. This is percentage of individuals engaging in alcohol or other drug use. I'm using alcohol illustrative numbers here. One of the challenges we have as prevention scientists, you cannot prove scientifically something didn't happen, right? Those of you who studied science, that's just not the way it works. That's not how the logic is predicated. So for prevention scientists, we also have to say, well, can we change patterns across time? Can we change trajectories? Well, one thing as an adolescent specialist is there are developmentally normative increases in alcohol and to some extent marijuana consumption across adolescence, okay? When you look at the national data from the National Household Survey, it's very clear. When people get to be about 90 years old, the vast majority of people have at least had one drink in their lifetime. Maybe they had that one and they never drank again, right? But in terms of lifetime use rates, it's fairly common and socially acceptable for alcohol consumption. But my job as a preventionist is to say, while this thing is normatively going up, I need to demonstrate statistically that it's not going up as much, okay? And this, for those of you who have studied methodology, for those of you who study statistics, this can be a very hard problem to deal with because often that requires a magnitude of scale. It requires big data sets, right? And as you know, with funding, that's not always the easiest thing to come by. So part of what I'm going to be sharing today really comes from the aggregation of data across multiple sites, because in order to really test these things, we need big numbers. So today I'm going to introduce Sandra Brown's Project Options that was developed at UCSD, as I said before. And this is a unique program in a number of ways that I'm going to talk to you about. So they started with the notion that alcohol is a drug of choice and a major problem for adolescents. It's still the most commonly used substance out there, okay? And we think about teens who are having alcohol problems. The research, much from Dr. Brown's lab, also from Dr. Winter's lab, and Dr. Wagner's lab, who are also involved in this project. We know that they have difficulty receiving treatment. And some of that comes from themselves. Some comes from, they don't recognize that this is necessarily problematic behavior, or even if they do, the programs just don't seem like they fit for them. Right? They have a stereotype of sort of this older white male standing up and saying, "Hi, my name is," and telling their story. And not to say that that's not a way that people change their behavior and affect change, but for a 15-year-old girl, that's just not going to seem like an attractive choice. Okay? So in some ways, some of the barriers are also systematic. We just don't have enough treatment programs for youth. That's just the way it is. Now, little is really known, too, about how teens actually change their behavior. The vast majority of teens change their alcohol and drug use behavior without intervention. So why don't we understand more about that process of change that is already effective for some set of youth? In addition, as you understand how teens can self-regulate their drinking, we can use that information when we make and improve our prevention or intervention strategies, right? And so this research was really in line with the Institute of Medicine's call that we really need to restructure our services, right? To allow for innovation and really to provide better care, particularly for adolescents in this case. So Project Options is a voluntary, self-selected prevention program for youth that we offer in high schools. Let's unpack that. Voluntary. All right, now I am not a lecturer, just so you know. I teach in a small environment, so I'm going to make you do work, by the way, just in case you didn't know. So why would voluntary, do you think, be really important for adolescents? Why is that so important? Yeah. Right, exactly, right? So what we want to work through is the developing autonomy and independence of adolescents, right? So in the MI literature, they call it the righting reflex, right? You push, what is my natural reaction? Push back, absolutely, right? So the same notion here. Adolescence is a period where people are trying to develop their independence, become more autonomous. So when we do things that have that really top-down, I'm going to make you, right? That's not fostering intrinsic motivation, as we would say, right, for change. So adding the voluntary component, we feel really builds on adolescent development. And that's one of the other innovations here. It's developmentally focused. Instead of taking a program for adults and bringing it down to adolescents or taking a child program and aging it up, they really worked in the development of this program to work within what we understood about adolescent development and the needs of adolescents in this context. Okay? It's also contextually tailored with the notion that context, as I said, schools is the place where the kids are. Schools are also places that influence alcohol and other drug use, right? You know, I mean, even let's just think at the collegiate level, right? There's schools that are sort of infamous. I'm sure you have infamous schools in Texas for drinking. Sure, it's not this one, right? But you know, you have these cultures around consumption. We see this in high schools as well. So when you come into a school or a local community, you need to work with them. What are the issues they're facing? What is the language that they use? What are the contexts that are specific to risk in that particular community, right? And so using that to really, in this case, use a consumer-based approach. So what we do with Project Options is when you come into a new school or a new district, you focus group with kids. You focus group with teachers. You focus group with administrators. This program has been around for a very long time, right? I'll talk about the effective elements that came from research, but it has to be palatable to the community and germane to the community in which you're providing intervention. The one-size-all approach generally does not work, right? Because it doesn't speak to the needs of an individual, right? So that's part of what this program does. So in the early days of development, this was the early Project Options coming up with this model based on development, the empirical literature. In work at UC San Diego that I was involved in during my training as a young faculty member, we looked at various effectiveness of various formats in San Diego County. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is from a multi-site randomized control trial. So could we take this strategy that had worked successfully in San Diego and generalize it to diverse schools in different communities? So the program itself is based on this developmental social information processing model that Dr. Brown developed and published in 2001. And the idea is this is a social cognitive framework that suggests that self-change really comes in two phases. The first is quit reduction attempts. And this could be multiple attempts, right? It's this chance to try on this new role as a non-user, right? This attempt to try these different things, followed by engagement in cessation maintenance behavior. So you try and you fail, and you try and you fail until one time it sticks. And that's when you get into the maintenance phase. So what Dr. Brown and her colleagues did in the early stages of development was to really go to the empirical literature. What does the literature tell us works for change with youth as it relates to alcohol and other drug behaviors? And the first is this notion of perceived versus actual alcohol use norms. There's a very robust social psychological literature as well as clinical literature in the addictions that our norms are very influential of how much we use. So if I think that 80% of my peers drink, right? What do you think that does with my odds of being a drinker? Goes up, yeah, right. So if I think that on average, when my peers drink, they drink 8 to 10 drinks in a drinking episode, do you think I'm going to drink more or less? Right, I want to catch up, right? I want to be part of this group. Now, I'm saying kids, but I'll tell you, it influences all our behavior. This doesn't go away. It's a cognitive bias we all have and never get rid of, even though we know these things, right? It happens with my cookie consumption every time, okay? But what we do in this case is we actually take local data. We collect data either in our schools or our districts, and we share with kids the actual normative data. We say, you know what? Really, it's more like 25% of kids drink. And when they drink, they typically, if they drink 1 or 2 drinks. So we provide that normative feedback. Now, this is an alcohol predominant intervention, but we do provide normative feedback on marijuana. We used to do it for tobacco in the earlier forms of the project. I am happy to say that we actually pulled it out of the final trial because not enough kids were smoking. Unfortunately, I have colleagues who are adolescent smoking specialists. They're looking for new areas of research. I someday hope when I grow up, I too will be out of business as it comes to this. I don't think so, unfortunately. The second is expectancy effects. For those of you who are familiar with the work in Alan Marnock's lab, Damaris Rosenoil's work, looking at if I have an expectation, and expectancy is a learned association in memory. So if I drink, I expect Y to occur. This comes from Tolman's work in the 1930s with rats. Okay, we see this across species. My behavior is governed by those learned associations. So we have positive expectations. If I drink alcohol, parties will be more fun. If I drink alcohol, I'll be more attractive to the opposite sex. My graduate advisor, Gregory Smith, and his advisor, all the way back to Peter Nathan, Mark Goldman, have done work showing that actually these expectations, both positive and negative, they're fairly negative in first grade, but by second and third grade, they start to differentiate between positive and negative. And the relative ratio of those expectancies that early predict your drinking behavior much later on. So they're in place well before you drink. Anyone throw out, what are some common positive expectations if I'm drinking alcohol? Some positive expectancies. Parties will be more fun. What other ones? What about ones about dating partners? Do you get more attractive when you drink? That's a common one, right? I drink, I get more attractive. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Tension reduction, right? We have ones that, oh, if I have a couple drinks, then I'll be easier for me to socialize at this party. We have the negative ones. I drink, I fall down. I drink, I have cognitive impairment. I drink, I do something stupid socially. I mean, there's a number of them out there. Many scales. Dr. Brown's lab did this for many, many years. What interesting happens when they do laboratory studies is they basically have a bar lab. Looks, smells very much like a bar. I have always wanted a bar lab. I don't think I'm ever going to get a bar lab because all my participants are under 21 and they frown on that. But basically the idea here is that you have all the contextual cues for alcohol consumption. And then I randomly assign you to get a beer with alcohol or a beer without alcohol, right? Or a mixed drink. It's easier to do it with mixed drinks. And up until a particular dose, what we see is that people actually act in accordance with what their beliefs are, right? So that people say, oh, it was the life of the party, I had this wonderful time, and their behavior is coded. People act like they're more sociable and all of these things. And then we realize that they didn't get alcohol, right? So some of these effects, not all of them, are pharmacological. A lot of them are cognitive. So we talk about youth about that research. We teach them research design and challenge those belief systems. We also do number 3, which is very common to most intervention programs, like how do we deal with stress coping. Decisions and consequences really as decision-making training, right? Something fairly consistent in cognitive behavioral skills-based interventions. Alternate ways to have fun. This is something we hear from youth all the time, right? How many people here have ever worked with adolescents? Okay, so quite a number of people here. What's the big concern, adolescents-wise, about stop drinking or stop using or things like that? It's a primary concern. Yeah, all my friends do it. All my friends do it, right? You know, that's a huge, huge effect. We see this with adult heroin users, right? They don't want to stop using because all their friends they shot up with, right? None of us want to be socially isolated, but particularly during adolescence, it's a huge influence on behavior. So the fear is if I don't start drinking, I'm not going to get invited to the parties, right? And if I don't maintain my drinking or drug use behavior, I'm going to be socially isolated. So we spend a whole time with students talking about, well, what are the alternate ways to have fun? Where are there mutually exclusive activities that you could do with your friends where the alcohol and drug is not an option, right? So your choice not to use it isn't necessarily going to stand out in that context. And the final one is communication skills training, both with peers and with parents, right? Because we find so many things around youth is their inability to communicate clearly with their peers about issues that concern them or their parents. Now, some of these design things are very specific to this program. So basically, I'll talk a little bit about the conditions. That's of the most recent study. Basically, what we tend to do is the program is offered sequentially. So there'll be 6 sessions that rotate across a 3-week period. So let's say I'm in your school Tuesday, Thursday, and I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Students can drop in at any time that they want. Okay. So one challenge we have is in the past we were able to do this with passive consent, meaning that parents were notified of the intervention program in their schools. They could opt their children out because it's a voluntary program. We need the kids to be able to decide that they want to come. In the last trial, we had to do active consent, which adds challenges. Those of you who want to talk about, we can problem solve that later. There's a lot of things that we were able to do in terms of electronic consent and getting all the information out to parents, because this is different. If you're asking for parental consent for our program, what we're asking you to do is provide consent for your child to perhaps choose to come, right? Because it's a voluntary program. The other key point of project options is we need to do this programming when the kids are available. So we do it during lunch. One of the barriers we found is when you try to do this programming after school, especially with high school students, they've got soccer practice, they've got work, they've got siblings to take care of. It's very difficult to keep them in the prevention context. So we offer it at lunchtime. We provide lunch. So we've been funded. So we focus group this. I always have to say this. So what do the kids want? They want pizza and soda. Okay, so as a health promotion person, I hear that providing pizza and soda is not the most ideal thing in this context. But if they asked for kale chips, we would have bought them. But this is just what we work with. But we make sure that it's accessible so kids can come and eat. Anybody have a sense, anybody know how long is the lunch in the high schools in Texas around here? 30 minutes? Some of our schools, 20 minutes. So you will see brief intervention written here. It's brief, right? We are getting baseline assessment and doing an intervention in what a standard school lunch period is, which can be 25 minutes to 35 minutes depending on the school. So that's kind of the reality of school-based assessment. So, excuse me, I'm going to share with you a little bit of the data that we have from the early trials, so that second phase where we're looking at the effectiveness of the program. So in a paper we published in 2005, we found that about 18% of high school students did self-select into the intervention. So this was when it was a passive consent strategy, so 18% of students showed up at our door. And we did get kids across the use spectrum. So we had kids who were non-users, trying to make decisions about where they were going to use. We also had heavy users. Happily for us, we found that those youth with the heaviest alcohol use history, so in this case we defined it as 51 or more drinks in their lifetime. Now you think 51 drinks in your lifetime, 51 episodes, hey, their average age is 16. right? So these kids are pretty heavy drinkers. We were able to find that they were about 1.8 times more likely to attempt to quit than youth who had no intervention. We compared them against other schoolmates who had to come to intervention. And these same students were 2.4 times more likely to attempt to quit alcohol altogether compared to those youth who did not participate among that heaviest youth group. Now, if you're a non-user, those aren't very good metrics because you're not using, again, we proved that nothing happened. Right? You stayed a non-user. Now in 2006, we published another paper that really focused on, could we actually attract ethnically diverse students to the program, right? Because that's part of our goal, is to afford and to provide these services in communities that may not necessarily always get service. So we did find is that we were able to attract ethnically diverse youth, as well as boys. Boys often are less likely to kind of present to prevention than girls often. We also were able to get students kind of early in their careers as early in their youth careers as those who were a little heavier in their use. Now I'm also going to talk a lot today about doing breakdowns between process-oriented research and outcomes research. So we've sort of moved away, hopefully we've moved down the pathway. We know through meta-analyses that treatments tend to work versus no treatments. We know preventions often can have effects, but what we're really at now is what makes them work when they work. What are those active ingredients? So some of the very early process-oriented research that had been done in this area by some of my colleagues, that we were effective for students who attended the program in changing those peer norms I talked about. And what very interestingly they found was that youth who changed their peer norms to lower rates also showed changes in their alcohol use patterns, right? So that this could be considered a mechanism of action that we might think of as process-oriented research. And that was in comparison to youth who didn't come to the intervention. So this is kind of good early indicators. So we had some effects on in San Diego on the intervention. We could get different kids in. We could also, I'm not reporting it here. We also showed that youth who had trauma histories and bullying, particularly trauma related to bullying, also showed up in intervention. So we were getting kids who were at high risk. So the new project, this is the data collection that I'm going to talk about mostly today from 2012 to 2016, had a number of primary aims. The work I'm going to talk about today really comes under the heading of these first two aims. Now, as I said before, we had funding from the Women's Health Initiative as well as a diversity supplement where we were really focusing on what are the gender issues that play out in intervention. How do we understand ethnicity and race as it plays out in that program? So a lot of this work is still being done. Much of the data still feels like it's hot off the presses, so we're constantly analyzing on this side. So the multi-site trial of this project, San Diego was our hub. There was no data collected in San Diego, but they were our data hub. The primary investigator for this multi-site study was Dr. Brown. Mark Myers, also at UCSD, was part of that hub. And then we had investigators, myself in Portland, we had Ken Winters in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota, Eric Wagner at Florida International University, who are running sites in that area. What we are running in this trial is what we call a hybrid design. So it's a mixed effectiveness and efficacy trial. So when we talk about efficacy trials, right, we're generally looking at comparisons between randomizing to different conditions, seeing what the effects are on outcome. Effectiveness trials often tend to look at what's happening on the ground. Are we affecting change in implementation on a real kind of implementation level? So we were putting those two pieces together. So this is the design of the trial I'm going to talk about in this hybrid design. So what we are trying to do is actually look at the effect of project options against itself. And let me explain that. So we did not have a no intervention control on this one. What we had was a didactic control, or an education only. So those 6 sessions of project options I described, in one, they were done in what we call the full project options format. That involves motivational enhancement. So some of you may be familiar with motivational interviewing, right? This notion of working with clients to increase their intrinsic motivation for change. Motivational enhancement techniques are a broader class of interventions where we're using those things in this prevention setting, intervention setting with youth. So the full project options is I may be teaching them about the expectancy challenge, but I'm allowing students, instead of lecturing, I'm asking students to generate the content. Because we know that youth, and even in all group interventions, people learn and are often most impacted by what their peers have to say. So we're soliciting and creating a climate where people are evaluating the pros and cons, where they are talking about this experience from their own point of view. The didactic or educational setting was exactly those same 6 sessions, but we were more lecturing, we were teaching, okay? This is a very high bar for condition difference, right? All we're changing. So again, process-oriented research, really looking at those active ingredients. So what we see is we had the 3 sites. Schools worked as their own control. So each year you were randomized to be an project option school or an ed school. There was a 3-month washout period, so the school served as their own control. So if I started in project options 1 year, the next year I had my summer washout, I was in education control the next year. Okay. So it allows us to use that as the control. We assess students at baseline when they enter the first session, and then we did follow-up at 4 weeks and 12 weeks electronically. Now, we did collect a lot of different variables. I'm obviously not going to talk about all of them today, but it gives you a sense of kind of the diversity of impacts that we can look at. Now, we gathered data in 3 different ways. So this was the format that we tested in this was a group format. So really depended on how many students came that day. We maxed out groups at 12, but they really ranged from 2 to 12 depending on the day. So we had students self-report. We had 2 interventionists in the room, and they also did self-report of their performance in a group performance. Looking at things like empathy and rapport and those sort of things from self-report. And then we had behavioral coders. So we had live coding in session. We could not tape. So those of you who've done any coding research, you understand what a undertaking this is. And I have to give credit to Ben Ladd, who's now at Washington State University, Vancouver, who's on faculty as a former postdoc, who had been trained in New Mexico with Barbara McCrady's lab and had learned MI there. And so he applied a lot of the coding strategies that they use in the clear coding to training our coders to watch our groups. So there we could also look at things, what does the outside observer see in terms of engagement, responsiveness, the amount of statements students are making about healthy choices or unhealthy choices. So we have 3 modes of data collection. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the initial work that we've done on race, ethnicity, and gender as effects on process. Okay? So I need to start that this work was conducted by Lupe Bacchio, who's now on faculty at Pomona. She actually was an undergraduate research assistant in California who later served as a postdoc, and this is her work, so I want to give her credit for this. And it's been my pleasure to have her both as an undergraduate and then work with her as a postdoc and now as a faculty member. But Lupe's primary interest is looking at this issue of race and ethnicity and how does that play out in intervention. So the research that we know, if we look at the Monitoring the Future work, what we see here is differences in rates. So people who identify as white in schools have the highest rate of alcohol consumption, followed by individuals who identify as Hispanic, Black, African American, and Asian American, in that order of use. We have stereotypes, we have cultural stereotypes about who users are in our society, and often they're backwards, okay? They're often backwards. Now, what we do know is that youth who identify as Hispanic and Black or African American tend to initiate alcohol use before the age of 13 more than their white counterparts, but they're not necessarily the highest volume users as we look at them in adolescence. The thing that we do know from the literature, though, is that ethnic minority use tend to see more negative consequences as an effect of their consumption, even though their rates are lower. We could have a whole long discussion about that, right? Some of it's sanction related, some of it's downstream effects academically, etc. But we do know, as I've already said, we know that there's barriers of care to ethnic minority youth as it comes to getting intervention services for alcohol and other drugs. Now, what we have seen is the gender gap is narrowing. Okay, and I'm going to talk about my definition of these terms in a moment. Okay, but traditionally we used to see that people who were assigned male at birth tended to have higher rates of consumption than people who were assigned female at birth. Those numbers have become more equitable across time. I would not say that this is one as a woman that I say is great for us, right? This is not a level of equity that I'm actually striving for, because we do know that based on sex differences, the female body, we process alcohol in ways that is much more negative for us in terms of health and consequences, right? A lot of it has to do with alcohol dehydrogenase and the breakdown of alcohol and the amount of toxins involved for us, but it's not necessarily a good thing. Now, we do see, though, differences in patterns of consumption. So boys tend to have greater risky use or binge drinking. Now, that's defined by NIAAA as 4 drinks if you identify as male, 5 drinks if you identify as female, in a 2-hour period where your blood alcohol concentration gets to 0.08. Now, often in survey, you're not asking, did you get over 0.08? We usually just ask, how do you identify and how many drinks did you have in that period? What we do find for girls in some of this data is that girls tend to have protracted heavy drinking, which again has consequences. But boys tend to see these jumps. Okay? And we know youth consumption is determined by availability. So if you had to guess, not knowing the data, just based on what I just said, when do you think kids tend to drink? When do kids, day of the week, hour of the day, when do you think kids drink? You can guess. Yeah.
Weekend nights.
Weekend nights, that's right. Same time college students tend to drink, right? Because, right, unsupervised time away from parents, right? We know this. If you come to my talk tomorrow, I'll be talking about why we construct certain of our simulations around certain characters, right? So youth drink on weekend nights when no one's around. So, you know that statement, smoke them if you got them? Teens, drink it if you got them, right? So what we tend to see is heavy episodic drinking in youth because when there's alcohol, they consume it for a variety of reasons. 1, it's available, and 2, you got to get rid of the evidence, right? So kids will actually drink quite heavily in these episodes, which leads to a lot of downstream problems for them. So when we're talking about prevention, we also need to be mindful that this is not like an adult who can go to the bar whenever they want or can just go to the liquor store whenever they want. We need to think about those contextual constraints on their behavior. So the Society of Prevention Research has said, because we know that these things differ based on race and ethnicity, we have to change our mode of operation. Right? We can't just do the one-size-fits-all approach. Now, I want to be very careful as I define my terms here. So I'm going to be using the definition of gender that Katie Witkowitz in a recent paper put out. That if we talk about gender, we're talking about something that's defined by societal and cultural roles and behaviors associated with biological sex and the identification as female, male, or mixed gender identity, which is different from sex, right? Sex, which is defined by biological characteristics and associated physical and physiological features. Now, I will say there is not enough research on people with mixed gender identity, okay? To my knowledge, and maybe someone knows more if you do tell me, I know of one study at the collegiate level that looks at alcohol and I believe other drug consumption among university students who are trans. What that data suggests is that trans-identified students drink more, disproportionately bear the burden of negative consequences from drinking, and are much more likely to be assaulted in those contexts. So this is an understudied group. I put to all of the students out there, it's time for us to change how we assess sex and gender, because we do not know enough about people who do not endorse a binary definition. So I'm going to say that, and now I'm just going to use the binary, because that's the reality of the data stream we have right now. but it's something that needs to change. The definition of race and ethnicity that I'm going to use today comes from the National Institute of Health, and it's based on self-identification. So I'm not identifying anybody, it's what people tell us. Ethnicity currently as defined is whether you identify as Hispanic or Latinx, right? It's a yes or no dichotomy, okay? In terms of race, it's divided into the following categories. So American Indian or Alaskan Native, being of Asian descent, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, white. Now, it's a forced choice format. So one downside of this forced choice format is if you are of mixed racial background, I am forcing you to pick one parent over the other, right? And that's problematic. People have how they identify differs. And sometimes we'll say, well, mark all that apply. Well, analytically, then what happens is you get one group that's mixed. And I'm not sure that's particularly helpful for us to understand how different factors influence our behavior, but it's where we live. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is this notion of intersectionality. So when we talk about intersectionality is we're basically looking at multiple categories of group membership. Now, someone asked me at lunch a great question, like, how do you define this? Unfortunately, we start doing interactions of all these binaries and categories that we do. But what it does is it allows someone to identify, for example, as an African-American Latino woman, right? It allows you to have different aspects of identity represented because the intersectionality research suggests that these binary or categoricals, when you have multiple levels of identity, miss out on a lot of the health promotion as well as the negative health-related consequences that can come from that stress. And one of your colleagues is doing work in this area. So you have to stay tuned. All right, so first today I'm going to share from Loopbase work as well as Tracy Garcia of my lab and a number of other folks on the project, was asking the question, can youth from racial and ethnic minority groups access the program? So what I'm showing you here is in red, what Loopbase did is look at the demography of the school. And then compare that into green, what was the demography of project options? Now there's interesting research. So there's one at looking at matching demography, right? How consistent or congruent are you with your community itself? And there's also ways of looking at ethnic congruence, because there is research to suggest that students who have congruence, who are in ethnic minority groups, have more positive outcomes on various health-related indices and stress if they match their school, right, or they match their peer group, right? So it's different from diversity, right, because diversity is heterogeneity. But being heterogeneous and you're one person in your school representing a particular demographic group is extremely stressful, right? Luckily, what Lupe was able to demonstrate was that students who self-select into the intervention really represent the ethnic makeup of the school where we did the intervention, which is good, right? We're not self-selecting, they're not self-selecting based on these characteristics. Really exciting, we've improved off our California data. About 80% of participants came back for at least one more session, right? And that's definitely an improvement. I think the average was about 3 to 4 visits, which is an improvement over our earlier data. African American and Black identifying participants were more likely to return to future sessions than their Hispanic, White, and Asian American counterparts, which is an interesting finding. We need to do more probing as to what that is. Unfortunately, this was not mixed methods research, so I couldn't talk to students. We couldn't find out why the students might have felt that, but we're going to probe that a little bit more. But we didn't see any gender effects as it related to entry into the program. So we were also interested in understanding whether ethnic congruency or diversity impacted group process, given, as I said before, how these factors affect outcome for youth. And so in this study, we looked at only those youth who were in this active version of project options. We looked at participant satisfaction, the interventionist's own ratings of empathy and rapport, and overall group engagement and responsiveness is assessed by the raters, as I talked about. Now, what we found here, and I've highlighted some things in red. So What we found in self-reported satisfaction from students is that groups that were majority African American, in this case, I believe that was identified by about 66% of students in that group identified as the same minority group, or I shouldn't say minority group, as the group met their demography. So groups that were majority African American had greater satisfaction than groups that were majority white. Majority Hispanic groups had higher satisfaction than majority white groups, but there was no difference between African American and Hispanic students. We also found that the interventionists felt that they were more empathic in those sessions than they were with their white counterparts. This is fascinating to me. The vast majority of our interventionists were white identified. So this is an interesting thing for us to probe in terms of research, right? The very rosy Pollyanna perspective is, wow, we did this great job connecting with our kids of color in intervention. Or was it that our white interventionists tried harder? Did they feel somewhat level of discomfort? And so then they kind of were putting in extra. I don't know the answer to that question. It's something that process-oriented research needs to delve into. But given that the students also were satisfied and these folks were feeling pretty empathic, who knows? Maybe there was some sort of synergy there. Interestingly, though, the raters saw no difference in these groups. So if those of you who are clinically trained or clinical students here, this is an interesting thing to think about, right? So much of what the transaction is in intervention is an interpersonal endeavor, right? Those of you who study working alliance, those of you who study empathy and rapport. So it's interesting that we don't see this corroborated in terms of how much they heard in group, but there was something seemingly going on at this level, but it definitely needs to be examined further. We had no effect of gender in this investigation. So, as seen as I just showed, right? We didn't see this effect for gender. So now we wanted to really focus on gender alone. Right? Can we see, what are we seeing in terms of gender in process? And we're really interested as to whether girls and boys differed on group processes. We looked at satisfaction and engagement by raters again, or I'm sorry, satisfaction by self-report, engagement and responsiveness by group members. And did this vary as a function of the proportion of girls or boys in group? And Tracy Garcia took the lead on this, who's now at UW. And she was really working at what did we see in the treatment literature. So the treatment literature tends to show that women tend to be more dissatisfied in mixed gender treatment groups for substance use. Qualitative research suggests it's because they feel obliged to help out their male counterparts, to provide emotional support, to kind of help them through the process, which takes away from their own treatment. If you look at the IO literature, or we look at group process literature in classrooms, what we do find is that girls and women tend to be interrupted by men and boys in these settings. So a lot of research kind of made us wonder if we wouldn't see some effect of this in the intervention groups. So what Tracy did in this study, this is sample. So this research happened before we were finished with the trial. So we have about 220 groups here. Using group actor-partner modeling, she tested these group processes. And there was accounting here for how many sessions you'd come to, how many people were in the group. So this is too hard for you to see, so I'll just give you the take-home message here. But basically what we found is that girls were more satisfied when there were more girls in group, and boys were more satisfied when there were more girls in group. Okay? Now we kind of laugh, right? Because you think in some ways we could take sort of a heteronormative perspective, well, boys like where girls are. I don't think that's it. Right? If we look at the literature, I have to thank Kathy Olson, my colleague at Reed, who's a social psychologist. If you look at the literature on friendships in adolescence, boys prefer to disclose personal information to their female friends. That they feel that intimacy in the relationship perhaps is a safer space for those level of disclosures. And as much as this is a brief intervention, it's not therapy. What we see, though, is perhaps in that group process, boys are feeling safer to disclose concerns about coping or problems communicating in this environment. However, as preventionists, we're sort of in a pickle here, right? because everybody wants more groups with more girls in it. It's a voluntary prevention program. I can't control that. But where we're going with this is looking at kind of hazard models or looking at survival curves. Is there a particular number of people where the tipping point happens? Is it 60-40? Is it 55-30? You know, what is that breakdown? Tracy's also following up with this work to look at, and she presented a paper at RSA looking at whether Hispanic identification affected this. And we're also looking at the proportion of users and non-users, right? So this is the type of process-oriented research that we're working on here. So the final bit of work I want to present to you today is this issue of intersectionality. So this is not process-oriented work like these studies I just talked about. This is outcomes. So this is some work that a cast of thousands has been working on. All of our partners across the different sites, but I do want to give credit to my team. Tracy Garcia, Genevieve Dash, she was an undergraduate of mine and was an interventionist on this project through her master's program, is now at University of Missouri. Lupe, who I've talked about, Ben Ladd, Jake, who is also one of our interventionists, and another one of my postdocs, Amanda Taylor. So we were trying to understand, how do we understand all these aspects as it relates to outcome? So as I said before, we're looking at intersectionality. Now, unfortunately, we were using the binary, right? This is what NIH asked us to report out. So what I have is 0, 1, female and male. Race. So you saw some of those demographic numbers. Actually, my sample is more non-white than white, if we want to use that distinction. I was so happy. We have so much ethnic diversity in the sample. I mean, I should say racial diversity based on the way it's defined here. I had to dichotomize this variable. 6 months of banging my head against the wall analytically. I had to dichotomize this variable because I was using hierarchical linear modeling such that students were nested in schools, right? Because we know that school context matters. And so our schools were pretty heterogeneous on use patterns, so we wanted to look at kids nested in schools, right? It's very typical in our research. 6 months, models crashing, models crashing, models crashing. So what do you do as a methodologist? Who does statistics? If your complicated model doesn't work, what do you do next? Simplify it, right? You simplify the model. So I said, you know what? I hate to do it. I'm gonna dichotomize race. Guess what? It all worked. Anyone want to hazard a guess why race nested in schools broke? Kids go to school in the United States with people who are remarkably similar to them. The U.S. educational system has progressively gotten more segregated over the last 30 years. African American kids go to schools that are predominantly African American. Hispanic kids go to schools that are predominantly Hispanic. So unfortunately, what ended up being an analytic decision, when we look at the numbers, it fits the reality on the ground. Okay? So that's just a thought, something to think about. And then ethnicity was also dichotomized. So we had a number of intervention outcomes that I looked at in the study. So past 30-day drinking status, and it was nested within kids, just so you know, because we have baseline, 30-day, and 3-month. So we have past 30-day drinking status, yes or no. Did you make a quit attempt in the past 30 days? Do you have a desire to cut down and quit? And then do you have future intentions to drink? So, as I said, this is our analytic sample. We have 1,170 students who finished the trial, but I needed more than 2 data points. So I had about 870 students in the trial. And these are the breakdown, again, baseline in 1 month, baseline in 3 months. We did see that the demography of the sample was different based on kids who had follow-up. So we had about we had a high representation of people identified as girls, average age about 16. As you see here, 37% white, 42% Hispanic, 42% 12th graders. So across the intervention, we tend to be somewhat more flat as it relates to freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. But we have more seniors who do more than one assessment period. Okay? So we do see some of those demographic shifts. So as I said, I use hierarchical linear modeling. And this is the nesting strategy. And what I did is that we had the main effects model, and then I put in the two-way, the three-way, and finally the four-way interactions, which I almost want to give you a nosebleed analysis, analysts out here. Four-way interactions give me the hives. But in this case, one of them worked out. And what you see is, then we test whether these additive influences impact the model significantly. So what I will say was that intersectionality was not supported for the most of our outcomes. Okay? What we found was if we look at the number of quit attempts in the past 30 days, having a desire to cut down and quit, or engaging in alcohol use in the past 30 days, or intentions to cut down or stop drinking in the next month, they were all main effects models that were supported. So what we found is if you identified as white, you were much less likely to want to cut down or stop drinking and reporting a desire to cut down or stop compared to students who identify as students of color. Being white increased the odds by almost a factor of 2 of being a current drinker as compared to students of color. So that's not atypical based on those epidemiological patterns that I highlighted to you before. So on this particular set of outcomes, neither gender nor Hispanic identity related to this particular set. And we also found that being a boy and identifying as white decreased the odds of actually cutting down or stopping. But we actually did get that nosebleed four-way interaction, okay, that we found supported. So we did find intersectionality for intending to drink in the next month. So what we found was that boys who identified as white and Hispanic in the active PO condition, project options condition, were less likely to intend to drink in the future. Okay, good news, right? So Hispanic identifying boys seem to get something out of this kind of motivationally enhanced component. Downside is their comparison group were girls of color in the didactic condition. The didactic condition looks a lot like prevention as usual in most schools, right? Taught in health classes, very much a teaching experience. So, as we kind of pull this all together, so we did find pretty consistent effects for race and current drinking as the most common predictors, with higher endorsement among whites and less interest in change. Gender and ethnicity did not have independent effects. That was somewhat surprising to us based on what we saw, but we did see this effect of intersectionality. Now again, we need more research to understand why this happens. My intuition and my guess from talking to my team, I have no data to support this, I think format really matters. Sarah Feldstein-Ewing, who is at New Mexico, is now at Oregon Health Sciences University, has found some interesting issues related to Hispanic identity and motivational interviewing in juvenile justice populations. It could be that what we're seeing here is that being a member of the dominant culture means that the didactic condition is probably a format that's been pretty successful for you before. Right? It's very much like being taught in school, right? But that for kids who may be in marginalized groups or groups that of different kind of racial and ethnic constellations, there's something about that empowerment, perhaps, in that motivationally enhanced condition where they're given greater autonomy, they're given greater freedom, they're learning from each other that may be helpful. I don't know. That's definitely total conjecture that needs to be tested empirically. So some of the strengths of this research, obviously it's a multi-site study. We could test this among different locations. We have diverse communities and schools. The limitation is this dichotomization, right? We spent a lot of time today, some of the graduate students and I, talking at lunch, trying to find new ways to assess identity, to think about intersectionality that allows people to endorse the continuum of ways that we may identify ourselves. I will tell you selfishly from a statistical rationale, the more variability we have, the greater ability we have to detect certain effects, right? The same problem was also in our dichotomies of outcomes. Because a lot of our participants they may not be drinking, because it's prevention, right? There's a lot of zeros in that data set. We dichotomized a lot. It's not surprising to me that actually we found the four-way interaction in the outcome variable that remained continuous. We had more variability. But that needs to be considered as we think about these findings today. So we have a whole lot of data and hopefully more time. We're going to be looking at a lot of these issues. We have this process-oriented data in groups. We need to find ways to connect it to the individual level outcome data. We're working on that now. We also have a number of other kind of change process studies coming, looking at cognitions, norms, self-esteem. I have one of my undergraduate thesis students is submitting for publication his paper on drinking refusal self-efficacy through this intervention. So there's a lot of things that we have yet to work on. So just to end, I want to thank all of the participating schools and districts and families, all of the lead researchers here, and this is just the I think I had 35 undergraduate research assistants who worked on this project, innumerable postbacks, and that's just my lab, let alone across the country. So none of this can happen without them. So thanks very much. I'm happy to answer questions. I should have said you could have stopped me along the way. Any questions? Criticism? Ideas? Suggestions? Yeah.
Curious about your well, great talk, first of all. Thank you. I'm curious about your take on parental attitudes towards substance use and or parental use rates at home and how that might factor in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I have a colleague at Utrecht University, Ina Koenig. Her research is on parents and parental interventions to impact youth drinking and marijuana use, and they use schools and parent interventions. Parents are a huge piece of this, right? Now, there was this time in the 1980s where there's this real push in the developmental literature that parents became totally superfluous when the kids became adolescents. There's nothing in the literature that supports that. I think a lot of parental influence certainly occurs well before adolescence, right? So a lot of this thing I was talking about, expectancies and motives, that's modeled behavior from a purely behavioral standpoint. A lot of our beliefs about alcohol come from watching our families of origin and learning from them. We also know that parental control strategies that are in place in our communication styles with our kids between the ages of 7 and 9 actually predict their alcohol, drug use, and sexual behavior in adolescence. So there's so much of that parental modeling of behavior, communicating expectations for their children that I think are central to this piece. I think also in adolescence too, the research seems to suggest that actually parental monitoring can be a real effect on adolescent drinking and drug use behavior. But it's actually not, interestingly, it seems, what parents actually do. It's what the kids think their parents are doing. So they've done, I don't know if you're familiar, but 10 years ago or so, they did some really interesting research asking kids about parental monitoring and parents about parental monitoring. What was driving the effect is what the kids thought their parents. So a lot of what we talk about parents in Ina's work is making clear behavioral expectations for your children about drinking and other drug use. To the second half of your question about parental use patterns, clearly that has a large impact. And it's hard to disaggregate, right? Apples don't fall far from trees, but they happen to be raised in the same orchard, right? And so it's hard to disaggregate how much is it potentially genetic, how much is it shaping and modeling of behavior. Lori Chassen's been doing work on this for many decades on children of alcoholics and how that relates. So we do not have a parent training component in this program, but there are definitely folks who are working on Connor Gilligan has also done work in this area in Australia, working on that piece as well. So I think that would be a lovely adjunct to add this to this program.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For Hispanics, there's like the answer too. We're looking at whether people's attitudes are primarily traditional versus are they in fact feeling by culture.
Oh.
And I just wondered if we could take the idea of ethnicity and race and make that into something that is more scalable.
Yes.
Then I think it would really help to capture some of the values. Because otherwise, we worry about the within culture bias that all whites are.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's so. The thing is, our categorizations are ridiculous, right? We're talking. You can talk about Hispanic, Latinx, in one. Don't get me started on Asian American. I mean, we're pulling together such diverse cultural backgrounds and such diverse expectations, etc. So I would love to get to a cultural frame and how we think about this. So my talk tomorrow, I do work in the Netherlands, and I have some work where we're comparing some simulation work with Dutch and US, but we're still not capturing what that cultural person is. So I guess, I'm open to discussion and suggestions on how we do that and how do we assess that piece systematically, because I think that's really where we need to go. I'm not wedded to these operationalizations. I feel sort of somewhat chained by them more than anything else, but it's what I've got. Yeah.
So when you're looking at race and ethnicity, about how people self-identify, do you have a way that people could maybe well, I know you were talking about some of the issues that are associated with if they identify as more than one, and they had, especially in some of these mixed race and who's perhaps white or African American. But is there a way that you can measure what they would prefer? Just because someone might self-identify more as being African American, but their physical characteristics might resemble more for a different race or ethnicity. So socially, in different contexts, they're viewed more as a race that they don't necessarily personally self-identify, but they're getting different effects from that.
That's a great point, right? So there's been a lot of work in cognitive and social psychology around, particularly in African American populations, about Afrocentric features, and as well as skin tone, and how those external cues very much change how other people treat you and identify you, right? Especially when we talk about groups that have been marginalized traditionally. So much is not just who I am, it's how other people perceive me. And I think in some ways we run the risk, and I'm going to use this term just because it's the best one I could come up with, we tend to be victim blaming when we use a psychological frame where we ask people to self-identify and then use that as a way to dissociate groups of people. Because that has nothing, you're right, there's many times where how you identify and how others perceive you are different. And depending on the cultural history that goes with that identity, totally shifts your brain. So, for example, some of this is anecdotal for kind of sociological research. So people who are light-complected get very different treatment outside and within their own community as it relates to that issue of tone. So, yeah, it's something, and that becomes really tough, right? Because, I know in the cognitive literature and some of the social psych literature, what they do is they'll actually morph faces. They'll take an image of someone and they'll change physical features on the face to make it more or less Caucasian, and they'll modify skin tone, and then they use identifications by participants, either of matching race or other race, to see what cognitive biases may be there, maybe impacts on various outcomes or attributions. And so it's hard to think about how would you operationalize that in this context, through these assessment procedures. But I think it's a really important question. I think it's a great. I feel like I'm saying everybody's got it right and I do it wrong. It is what it is. That's the whole point of coming giving scientific talks, was to get these great ideas and how we think about things differently. Anything else? Well, I'll be here. I'm playing North Texas for the next 2 days, so if you can come and catch my later show, I'll be happy to answer questions. But thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to come to you all. Thank you.